For those of you who are wondering why the State Department of Conservation has anything to do with oil and gas production, it's because one of our divisions is the Division of Oil, Gas, and Geothermal Resources. Some of you know it as DOGGR. We like to know it as the division. Tim Kustik, who is right over here in the corner, is the State Oil and Gas Supervisor. Both of us are relatively new to our positions. Neither of us are really new to these issues, however. What I'd like to do for the agenda, what I'd like to do is give a quick overview. I am not a technician, but I'll give a quick overview in what I hope is not jargon-laden terminology. I would welcome anybody who says, feels like I'm getting a little jargony. It's only because I've worked so closely with the guys who deal with that it's sort of become part of my lingo. Call me out on it. I will try to take it to the understandable, to a non, as John puts it, a non-petroleum geologist, non-petroleum engineer level. Okay, oil and gas drilling in California. The point was made earlier that fracking, which is really what I think a lot of people here are concerned about today, that fracking is a process that is applied to wells. Let's take a step back first before you even have a well. Before you have a well, you need to get a permit. You get that permit from DOGGR. That's separate and distinct from any land use entitlement about whether you can or can't have a well in this zoning area. This is very specifically about whether, once you've got that entitlement, you're going to put a hole in the ground and you're going to drill down through multiple layers of geology. Geology is important. We're going to talk about the geology and how that's a little bit different here than it is back east, but we'll get to that. As you go through these different layers, there's groundwater, there's underground sources of drinking water. You finally get to, well, at least the oil and gas guys hope they get to, that area, that pay zone, that natural gas or that oil. Here in Southern California, we're principally talking about oil. Okay? There may be associated gas, and there's a whole heck of a lot of water. Sometimes 70, 80, 90% of it water. But you're trying to get to that pay zone where that hydrocarbon is. As you drill that well, you're putting casing around that well. So you've got a metal drill string, you've got cement that's coming out to form a casing, you've got something called the surface casing, which goes down to a certain depth, you've got casing that runs even. All of that is spelled out in the rules for how you drill a well. When you drill these wells, they have to be able to withstand pressures. The pressures they have to be able to withstand are the ones that are being exerted by the earth, as well as anything you're going to put down the hole, or anything that's going to come up the hole. Okay? If there is a compromise of that at any point in time, by rule, you have to fix it. You can't just let it sit. So you find these things when you start seeing pressures fall off. The pressure's not going where you want it, it's leaking out over here. Whoops, that's a problem. Gotta go find it, gotta go fix it. All of that is what DOGGR does. So, we drill. We oversee the drilling of wells to get to these production zones. There's a whole bunch of stuff that deals with, it's relatively recent, that deals with facilities and what regulation there's of those. I'm not going to get into those right now. That's not really what the subject is. But DOGGR also deals with the facilities. Once you've got the well, the question really is, what kind of a well is it? Now, there are differences in construction, whether you're talking about a production well. Production well means things coming up the hole, or injection well, meaning you're putting things down the hole. I'm going to use a term there when I say injection well that from the oil and gas engineer side has a meaning, okay? To you all, it probably sounds like, well, you put something down the hole, it must be an injection well. Not necessarily, okay? And I raised this because I've done a little bit of research, not a lot of research here, a little bit of research. I know there is some question about the distinction between fracking and underground injection. There is a difference. So, why don't we just jump right into that? There is something called Underground Injection Control Program. It is overseen by the Division of Oil, Gas, and Geothermal Resources. One of the provisions of that is that you cannot exceed, on a UIC well, an injection well, you cannot exceed the fracture pressure of the formation into which you are injecting. Wait a minute. Fracking breaks the formation. It must have exceeded the fracture pressure. That's correct. Fracking is not an underground injection control project. When you drill a well and you're going to use it as an injector and you start pushing fluid through these very tight rock formations, the idea is not to break them. if you break them as you're trying to push from this well over here to this well over here, your producer, if you break the formation, you just created a weakness. Think of your windshield. If you crack your windshield and you've got a weak line in that windshield, that's the point where it's going to give. Where if you put the most pressure on that windshield, that fracture is where it's going to come right on through. If you're producing oil and gas, now again, oil here in the basin, you want a nice, steady, even push. So an injection well, an underground injection control subject well, doesn't want to break the formation. We don't want it to happen because that harms the resource, potentially harms other subsurface structures, but it also reduces your eventual ability to recover. If you can't push nice and evenly across the field to your producing well, you lose production. Fracking, as has been noted before, is the idea that you're going to inject above a fracture pressure. Go back to that slide for a second. The area that John was describing, that PXP was describing, the area that they were fracturing, they were 8,000 feet, and they were injecting in a zone that was 20 feet wide. The idea is to put a whole lot of pressure right there. Not all the way back up the drill string. That's one of the things we make sure doesn't happen. They aren't allowed to put that kind of pressure on there. But to put that pressure at that 20-foot zone, or something slightly above it, I don't know exactly where you put the block. But the idea is to force that pressure right there, to fracture right there, and then release it. In California, this happens primarily when you've already produced out. We're going to come back to that in a second. But you're breaking up the formation so that oil that's out beyond, say, that one point of the well string can actually go into those fissures and flow back to the low pressure that is inside that casing, inside that well. The whole point is pressure. High pressure out in the rock, break it open. Operators are required to have those to make sure that doesn't happen. Yes, it does sometimes happen in places like off in the Gulf, and it's tragic. And it even can sometimes happen here if someone hits a pocket that they weren't able to control. But we have preventers and rules and regs to make sure that doesn't happen. That happened in the past in California oil fields because they were all under pressure. There's 53,000, I think is the number that's been thrown around, 53,000 active wells in the state. That's a whole lot of pressure relief valves for the oil and gas fields of the state. There aren't a lot of fields in this state that have the ability to shove a column of oil out of the ground. I hazard to say there's probably none that have the ability to shove a column of oil up out of the ground and create this cascading gusher. So the issue here is fracking has happened in California, okay? And the reason it happens in California is, again, to loosen up oil. Fracking is considered a production stimulation practice. We are not required by law, we're not required to be told of it. This is something that's being considered in the legislature right now, so fear not. But we're not required to be told of it, okay?
You're not required to be told
of a frac job. Okay?
There's no law that says.
No law
you
that
must
says
be told.
before you do a frac job, you have to tell DOGGR.
There's no permit required.
The only permit that would come into play is if you actually had to do a rework. This was mentioned before. When you have to rework a well, and then they notice to us, hey, we're reworking this well because we're going to frac it, hey, then we know.
I thought you were regulatory.
Aren't you on
We are
site?
regulatory.
Could you require it if you wanted to?
We don't have any regulations for it right now.
But you're on site, right? That was what I was going to ask. Aren't you guys on site? When they're digging, aren't they?
52,000 wells on that. We have 6 field offices in the state, approximately. Tim, what's the total number of employees?
If they're all filled, 200, but we're probably close to 100.
And we do not have Division of Oil and Gas employees at every well site in every. The wells remain competent and that they aren't causing intrusion into other layers. That's what the regulation is. The regulation is to make sure that the wells are constructed appropriately.
So what is your monitoring system?
There is no monitoring system. Well, so the point of my talk really was to educate, advise about what are the regulations that the division oversees, to make sure that you all know that yes, compared to today, there may be issues where people are concerned about limitations on that. But they are the regulations that we have and that have been in place for approximately 40 years.
You should be regulating that, correct?
Again, we are regulating the integrity of the well and what they do with the well, whether it's production or putting things down the well.
But you said you don't know whether they're fracking or not.
Let's be clear about this, because this is something that came up in a prior conversation. The absence of knowledge about where fracking has happened does not mean that all of those regulations that I just described don't exist. These wells are constructed to those standards.
DOGGR therefore pays your salaries, and
Yeah.
if so, how does that affect your work?
The oil and gas assessment is something that is paid per barrel. If you produce more oil, you pay more to the state. And yes, it is true that the amount that is paid is from the oil and gas industry, but there is no one single operator who then speaks to us or that we respond to. We are a regulator funded by a fee placed upon the regulated industry, and that is common, whether it is in mining, whether it's in pesticide use. The fact of the payment of the fee for the regulation is not an indictment of the organization. As a matter of fact, it is a norm for the funding of regulatory programs in the state of California.
If a well, any type of well that's an oil field gas well, if it's leaking to the surface, if you see those gas bubbles leaking to the surface directly above the wellhead, will that well be investigated for its integrity and in an attempt to stop that leakage?
What you described to me, I can't quite comprehend what you're saying about
At a
He's
well,
talking about an AQMD violation.
no, I'm not. I'm talking about a wellhead, an oil well that is leaking gases to the surface, and you can see it coming up right above that wellhead. Will the DOG investigate that well to determine the leakage in any attempt to have whoever owns that well re-abandon the well?
Almost 8:30, and I see a few people kind of shuffling. If anyone, just in case, they might have to shuffle out of here. For the purposes of the study that's going on, once again, it is important that if you do have questions and topics that you would like to see addressed, it is important that you get those questions to us either in the form of these cards. Once again, I know I'm repeating myself here. And also, I think we will be able to accept the questions preferably by email up until the end of next week. For us, the county, yeah, next week. We've changed it to next week, Thursday, close of business Thursday, okay?
Email address?
It's at the bottom of the agenda. I'm sorry, I'll handle this.
Can they ask them here, ma'am?
Is that the end of your presentation?
Most of the, there was one thing I forgot to say, John, and that's this to the group here. You haven't seen DOGGR in these meetings in the last couple of years, and I've spoken with David recently about this. Tim and I are new, okay? And to be able to answer those questions up front. I'm not going to tell you that I can answer them all, or that Tim or anybody else who shows up can answer. I hope we can get to better than 50, 60, 70% of them at the end.
Can we start answering the question?
What I would like to ask is that people raise their hands. I don't want only the people who are willing to shout out questions, Dan. We do have about half an hour left, and you can ask questions.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Radioactive isotopes. Who will monitor the radioactive material that's going into the ground to trace your fracking process? And how is that going to affect my health and the health of this community?
something the division carefully watches. Radioactive tracers are commonly used in injection wells to test the injection wells. In the division, when we can, we're out there to witness those tests. That radioactive material has a very, very short half-life, and it's regulated by, I believe it's the California Department of Health Services. All the operators that use that material have to be licensed in the state. They're the best source for that kind of information.
You're monitoring, and are those reports public? How do we access what the findings are for the radioactive? You said you guys do regulate them, or you regulate the test.
No,
My question
what we're
is,
doing is we're witnessing a test of the injection well.
the usage or when it's happening. My point is there some type of report? Do you follow up? If it's short-lived, is it short-lived for 2 months, 6 months, 6 weeks, 2 weeks? Is it, and is it public information? How do we find that information?
You can find information. Okay, you can find the information regarding the test of the injection well in our well files in our Cypress District office. And the information on the radioactive material, that is regulated by a separate state agency, not us.
So it's not regulated. What agency does that? And so is that do you
believe
know
it's
that
the
report
Department of Health
monthly,
Services.
bi-yearly?
Wouldn't represent to have the first degree of knowledge about what's comprised in the radioactive tracers that are used. When you do a tracing, you don't always do a tracing. But what I can say is it would probably be one of those discussions, a focused discussion on radioactive tracers, and would be a benefit to this CAP to get more education out on it sometime in the future. Certainly I can answer that. Horizontal fracturing is in the precise type of drilling and fracturing technique that is occurring back east. What Paul Ferrazzi is referencing is in our drilling plan. We had a horizontal well listed as what we would eventually like to drill out here. We have no plans to drill any of those right now. We haven't designed those wells. And as I said earlier, for high volume hydraulic fracturing, we want to get this study out of the way before we're really thinking about that. The results from this study on the vertical wells with the fracs that were designed are going to translate to that type of practice. So we'll get, I mean, frankly, what our thinking was, let's design the type of frac stage that we know is applicable to the type of shale formation that we have out there, not do one of these enormous jobs that is, in fact, more of the size of concern, do it in a smaller batch, but at the level that we know we would need to do in 2 or 3 stages.
Regarding DOGGR's authority, you mentioned that you haven't changed your regulations for 40 years. You're still regulating based on conventional drilling. Is that correct? Basically?
The regulations have changed around the edges of 40 years. There has not been a change in terms of required notice about fracking.
For fracking, okay. Because the concern I have as a citizen is you know, being informed after the fact or having some communication is really not enough. We want to know that DOGGR is willing to do what they can under your authority to start initiating, having more oversight.
Right.
That is
Right.
really important. That,
Exactly.
and if you haven't answered that question, if DOGGR is willing to go another step.
My
transparent to the
That's
comment-
right, yay.
My comment
Thank you.
in response to the
We
question from
pay
the
your salary to do that, you don't do it, so what are we supposed to do?
Do you have
To
a
require
statutory
notification?
authority to regulate fracking? Do you?
I'd hesitate to answer that question right here without one of our lawyers telling me, yeah, 3106 or 32 something gives you that authority.
Does the state of DOGGR require a full EIR before permitting a new well, fracking or not?
When you're talking about permitting a well, CEQA is generally conducted already by the local government relative to their land use authority.
So did the county, does the
Yes.
county?
We did one.
That's what the lawsuit was about.
On the drilling of wells.
It was not done on fracking, it was done on the drilling of the wells, which is what the subject of the lawsuit was, which led to the settlement, in which PXP agreed to do a study on fracking, and to do the study on fracking, they gotta frack one. That's what they gotta do.
It's hard to study something you haven't done.
Can the county ask for a moratorium on any further development of these wells or fracking? Why not?
Because we implemented a moratorium before we enacted the CSD, and the state law limits the amount of time that you can put a moratorium on an activity for an area. We used that maximum time in order to hold public hearings, in order to develop the CSD and put it into place. So we're out of time.
Why did PXP wait 9 months and now rush us because they only have 3 months to get this study done? It's almost like with the EIR where we got rushed and really couldn't do adequate input.
The EIR's passed us. The
I know.
EIR stands as good, okay? I don't know that this study's been rushed. I think people have been proceeding through it to prepare it and go forward. It's your opinion that's been rushed, but...
I think our CAP members need to be more responsive to the communities they represent.
Have you been with DOGGR before, previous to
Yes.
appointing? Okay, so you know. So in that county council Lemke just referenced the EIR, I was wondering if DOGGR still takes the position that the Roberti Methane Task Force 1 report was what was considered the science for migration of gases, oil-filled gases.
I'm not familiar with that report.
Okay, because that report was discredited by the second report and then by independent.
Was this the study that was done?
We want to hear this, you know.
The Roberti.
The question came. I'll be loud, but it won't. The question was, are you familiar with the
Roberti Methane
Task Force report And I will tell you that neither Tim nor I are familiar with the content of that report. Tim just...
Well, I'm familiar with it, but it's probably been 15 years
But
since I read it.
that was discredited science, but DOGGR is taking the position that that's their, what they consider the science with regard to the migration of oil field gases. Because in that report they said that what... Yes, that's what the Cynthia Traxler letter, the response to the EIR, to the CSD, was with regard to the migration of gases. So, and what that report said was, in fact, Fairfax was biogenic, not thermogenic. And that was discredited by a number of different people, Bernie Enders, Chillingar, Dick Meehan, Douglas Hamilton, and you guys are holding on to the old science as opposed to embracing the new science. And in fact, that SPE conference where this report by Meehan and Hamilton was accepted was actually sponsored by DOGGR. So how it is that DOGGR can be holding on to what the oil company would call bad science whenever it comes to the public coming up with an issue with regard to how things are being handled. You're holding on to that. So I think
we're going to need some more details.
And then I also have one other issue, and that had to do with the consolidation of something like 23 lots in Culver City where their mineral rights were taken from them, not taken from them, but more or less taken by eminent domain using 3608. And 3608, or actually 3605 says, in fact, that it shouldn't apply to fields that were operating before 1934.
What is 3605? Is that a unitization?
It's a PRC.
I know it's a PRC, but is it a unitization section?
Yeah. So, and that was what I call the triad. It was Leeson, Baker, and Bopp in November of 2005 that decided that those 23, the mineral rights should be taken. They were getting their royalties, but they had no decision, no individual decision on their own. They weren't allowed to make that decision by themselves as to whether or not they wanted their mineral rights to be November of 2005.
Not familiar with that.
Okay. But if you can get more information,
I can sell you huge files on it. So.
But you are familiar with the 1985 Fairfax incident. The Ross Restful blew up. That resulted in the Roberti bill. Thus familiarity with what they decided was the gas and what Paul is referring.
I'm familiar with the incident. I actually remember in the news stories, but I'm not familiar with that methane study or anything.
And DOGGR's position that it maintains today that it was biogenic gas as opposed to the science that shows otherwise.
Some more information so we can look into it.
There's another CAP member on the other side of you, behind you, with a question.
Oh, I just want to point out, I am a member of CAP. It was brought on board, and it didn't happen. We also brought up that there should be more effort by the county to get the word out to people, and people are here, but I don't think it's thanks to the county getting the word out. It's thanks to other publication. So I feel personally rather helpless as a member of the CAP committee. I think we were put in place as a placeholder, and we're not being given any sort of decision authority.
If there's been no study for it, does that mean that before you develop the plan, there will be a study?
I can't speak to that, man. What I can say, I'm not going to commit one way or the other on that. What I can say is that this study was designed to do a one-stage frac that would be transferable depending on whether you did a vertical or a horizontal well in the shale zone. Our intent is to study the top of the entire universe, get the answers out to the public, because the public, if there are members of the public that still want to dispute it.
So when you put that pressure, can it not trigger an earthquake?
That's my question. No one has talked about earthquakes. This is a fault line. So how does fracturing, when all the other studies across the country talk about how it affects, and triggers earthquakes?
We have asked, it's a very good question. PXP asked, Dr. Cormier covered it, PXP asked that the possibility of seismic-induced events, i.e. an earthquake, from this activity be one of the items covered in the report. We voluntarily asked for that, so we know that's an issue that people are concerned about.
Yeah, but let me throw one more piece. In the study, does that mean there is a guarantee? So if his study comes back and it says that it's possible, because it is. I mean, I don't know what kind of study he could say that it's not possible that a fault line could be triggered. Are you not going to do fracturing? Bottom line, like, what is the guarantee for us? So we're here in this meeting, it's informational. What's the guarantee that you are not going to do? So I have a problem like with the bill. Supporting the bill says that it's okay to fracture, when really fracturing is not okay. We're in Los Angeles, California. We're in California. There's earthquakes. So to support a bill means that you are saying it's kind of okay to fracture, and if you do, let's monitor it. If we're saying as a community we don't want fracturing, what steps do we take? What do we do as a community if we do not want fracturing, period, in the community?
Here, here.
I think they can accept practice for stimulating well.
And there's problems all across the country. So I'm just asking, are you part of the public or are you part of the corporation? It's a basic question.
We have to get out of here in 5 minutes, and they really want us out of the parking lot by 9 o'clock. Is there anything else from the CAP that we need to do tonight? Somebody will send us one the next meeting.
Please have a larger venue next time.
About this meeting, what was good and what wasn't good?
I think what was good is that there's a good turnout. There's obviously a lot of concern about fracking here. I think the community, the more it learns about fracking, the more it's not going to like it and want it to be banned from this area. I think what's going to be needed is a community strategy to get a ban, a fracking ban here in the Baldwin Hills.
Good. It didn't seem like they want to listen to people too much.
No, I think the strategy for the industry and the agencies that are too friendly to the industry is to say there's nothing to worry about. Fracking is complicated. We're the experts. You people don't know anything. You just get all worked up about nothing. Just go home and watch television and be happy that the natural gas or oil is powering your TV. But I think the people here are too smart for that, are fighting back. And I think if folks get organized, we'll stop them.